This is episode 15 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Douglas Brewster, professor of English at the University of Texas at Austin. Another great method for studying the history of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
They absolutely were a real item of clothing and very widely worn by anyone who was vaguely fashionable or respectable. And again, it's going back to the development of the ruff from a very humble shirt collar with a frill on it. The story of the poofy pants, as you call them, it develops from Henry VIII's time, where they're fitted pants, or hose as he would call them, with a kind of puffed decoration just above the knee.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Hello, I am Cassidy Cash. This week we are talking with Ninya Mikhaila. She's the maker of high-quality reconstructions and replicas of historic dress, working to the individual needs of heritage sites, museums, and even private clients. She is co-author of the best-selling book, The Tudor Tailor, Reconstructing 16th Century Dress, published by Batsford in 2006. Ninya established her business in 1994 after gaining a higher national diploma in costume interpretation at the London College of Fashion. And in choosing to work in the field of sewing and tailoring, she follows in the footsteps of previous generations. A new television series from BBC4 features Ninya's work and is called A Stitch in Time. It will be presented by fashion historian Amber Burchard, taking a look at how clothes were made in the past and what reconstructing them can tell us about the people that wore them. She was costume supervisor for Britain's Tudor Treasure, A Night at Hampton Court, presented by Lucy Worsley and David Starkey on BBC Two. Ninya was responsible for sourcing the 100 costumes required for the recreation of the procession for the christening of Edward VI in 1537. In addition to her book, The Tudor Tailor, she is the co-author of the best-selling book, The Tudor Child, Clothing and Culture, 1485 to 1625, and the co-editor of The King's Servants, Men's Dress at the Accession of Henry VIII, and The Queen's Servants, Gentlewoman's Dress at the Accession of Henry VIII. Her expertise has been sought after by numerous historical television series done by the BBC, as well as historic royal palaces, the Royal Armouries, the National Trust, English Heritage, the National Archives, and Gainsborough's House. Ninya is married to Michael Perry, a sculptor and artist responsible for the illustrations in the Tudor Tailor range of books, and they live in Nottingham with their 2 daughters. Ninya joins us today to discuss Shakespeare's dress and specifically to talk about the legend that Shakespeare wore poofy shorts and that iconic gold earring in his left ear. Ninya, welcome. We're excited to talk with you today.
Hello, hi.
So not many people get the opportunity to write historical costumer on their resume, and I wondered if you could explain just briefly what that title means you get to do every day. Who do you get to work with and how do you help them?
Okay, well, my work is aimed at the world of heritage and education as opposed to theatre or film or television usually. So I make reconstructions of period clothing as accurately and close to the originals as I can possibly get them. So most of my clients are museums and people who work in the heritage world, although increasingly I do get private commissions from history enthusiasts who just want a very high quality period costume.
I bet that's a lot of fun to get to do.
It really is, and I never tire of the work really, because it's very rare that I do something exactly the same more than once. Everything is a new adventure.
Well, we mentioned in your introduction that you started your business in 1994 after you went to London College of Fashion. So this interest of yours has been something you've done almost your whole life. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. I started really with just an interest in history. I didn't particularly enjoy school as a child, and I didn't particularly like my teacher. But when she taught history, she really came to life, and she obviously had a love of it, which she managed to impart. And when she particularly taught us about the Tudors and Henry VIII and his 6 wives, I just found it absolutely fascinating and just wanted to know more. And from there, my mum took myself and my sister to a historical reenactment in Suffolk when I was in my early teens. And we had to make our own costumes and live as Tudor people. And I found that an amazing experience, and decided that I would follow the costume part a bit more and go and study it at the London College of Fashion.
Wow, that's amazing. I didn't even know they had events like that where you made your own costumes and got to go and experience Tudor fashion. But I think as a child, that would really make an impression to get to participate in something like that.
It does. And I think it's one of the reasons that I love the study of dress, the history of dress so much, is that actually it feels like a connection with people from the past. You know, you can't study the history of dress in isolation from the history of people. And that's what's really interesting.
Yes, which is exactly why we wanted to talk with you specifically about Shakespeare's dress. And I wanted to ask you to walk us through a few pieces of Elizabethan clothing and tell us whether Shakespeare would have worn them. And I'd kind of like to start with the ruffed collar. Can you describe that to us? What is it and what was its purpose?
Well, with so many of these fashions that kind of strike us as extraordinary when we look back at them today, it didn't start out as such an extreme thing. It was a thing that developed from something else. So in the time of Henry VIII, men wore shirts, sometimes with very small plain collars, but sometimes with collars that had a frill around the edge. And as the years went on, that frill became larger, and the larger it became, the more control it needed. So starch was introduced, and a more kind of formal setting of the frill into a figure of 8 shape arrangement occurred. And once it got so big that it couldn't be a part of the shirt anymore, it became a separate garment, which was called a ruff, or sometimes just called a band. And so by Shakespeare's time, it pretty much reached its biggest form. There were some really, in the 1580s, 1590s, there are some really enormous ruffs around. And then finally what happens in the early 17th century, the ruff kind of, well, literally collapses. And instead of being starched out stiffly like a plate, it's a kind of falling collar that just falls onto the shoulders before it disappears completely.
Wow. The 1580s and 90s is right when we think Shakespeare would have arrived in London. And I wonder if he would have wore this type of collar. Was the style attached to a particular status or station?
A lot of men in Shakespeare's time would have worn a ruff of some sort, but it, depending on your status, how big the ruff was and how fine the material was, whether it was trimmed with lace or not, would depend on your status and how much money you had. So it's likely that Shakespeare, coming from Stratford, may have been surprised when he got to London to see quite so many. I imagine he would have seen a lot of very large and ostentatious ruffs, and he may have arrived feeling quite smart in a simpler form, and perhaps they got larger when he got to London.
When he arrived. Well, on your website, you have images of a 1580s gent, is the way the picture is titled. And there's this gallery of clothing images representative of that time period. And one of them specifically caught my attention because it features a man wearing those poofy shorts. And I know that is not the correct term. Mm-hmm. I'm hoping you'll help me with the term. But we always see Shakespeare depicted in animated or cartoon versions wearing something similar to that. And I was wondering if you could tell me more about them. I mean, I think they were an actual fashion worn by people in England during the 16th century, as opposed to just, something we put on cartoon versions of Shakespeare today.
They absolutely were a real item of clothing and very widely worn by anyone who was vaguely fashionable or respectable. And again, it's going back to the development of the ruff from a very humble shirt collar with a frill on it. The story of the poofy pants, as you call them, is, it develops from Henry VIII's time, where they're fitted pants, or hose as he would call them, with a kind of puffed decoration just above the knee, and that puffing becomes more and more enlarged and more dominant until, in fact, the whole pair of hose is, a puffed arrangement. So it's a development. And some of the very extreme styles were padded out with various materials like cotton wadding or horsehair, or even filled completely with things like sawdust and bran.
So they'd be walking around with sawdust stuffed down.
Yeah.
That does not sound comfortable. What would that look like to get dressed? Would a man that's getting dressed in the morning have to stuff these shorts each time, or are they made stuffed with that?
We don't have much in the way of survivals from this period to work from, and so a lot of the evidence we have is gathered from documentary descriptions, from letters and household accounts and wills as well. The wills people wrote when they were dying, describing the clothes they were going to leave, are hugely helpful to us. And so they often give clues like, they'll say my round hose, which is the term for this style of puffy pants. And then they'll talk about bolsters or other parts of the hose which are to fill them. So it does suggest that the very solidly stuffed ones were stuffed with a separate part that wouldn't be there all the time. And also it's important to remember that the extreme versions of any of these fashions are only really worn by the elite and not by people who had to do any real kind of work.
Well, I love that we've created the puffy pants nickname for these. I hope that lasts.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you about when you make these for various museums. What are you using? This like same materials that they would have used then? Do you or I don't know if they're called reenactors, or the people that are wearing these costumes, do they have to walk around with sawdust, or do you adapt it for something more comfortable?
Yeah, I have to say I have never made a pair stuffed solidly with sawdust or bran. That's a project yet to come. So it's more common that they're interlined with a kind of a substantial fabric and then pleated or darted in underneath the leg openings and around the waist. So they become quite, they have a real form to them, but they're not actually completely solid. And they're surprisingly wearable, I've been told. I haven't actually worn them.
You haven't worn them yourself.
But yes, I mean, that is the difference really with the kind of work that I do and theatrical work, is that wherever possible, I'll use materials which accurately represent the kinds of materials that were used at the time. So no synthetics or cheats or shortcuts.
Yes, I was going to say no shortcuts. Well, another outfit essentially, I guess, ascribed to the Tudor period of dress is the doublet and jerkin. And can you explain what those are? What they do, and I suppose you can correct my pronunciation as well. But why were they worn?
So your pronunciation was fine. So when a man like Shakespeare was getting dressed, you'd imagine him first in his shirt. The shirt is the first layer he would wear, and that would be made in linen, and that's the only garment that could be washed in water like we wash clothes today. And it's the only garment, apart from possibly a pair of linen drawers as well, that would touch the skin and so therefore needed to be kept clean in the way we wash clothes today. Over the top of his shirt, he'd wear his pair of hose and a pair of stockings. And then on top of that, on his upper body, he would wear a doublet, which is a closely fitted jacket, really, to our eyes, usually buttoned down the front with sometimes closely fitting sleeves, but also in the 1580s and 1590s, you get some very voluminous sleeves that are very voluminous at the top and then narrowing down to a fitted wrist. And then the jerkin is actually cut very much along the same lines as the doublet, quite closely fitted, but it usually doesn't have any sleeves. So it's almost like what in England we would call a waistcoat, and I think in America you'd call a vest. So,
yes.
A sleeveless garment that goes over the top of the doublet, usually in a contrasting fabric, and it can be worn buttoned or unbuttoned. So it's partly for extra warmth, and it's partly for visual effect to have, layers of interesting and lovely fabrics going on.
Well, again, from your online gallery of costumes, there's a big difference actually between the tailor's costume and the costume you had listed for Sir Walter Raleigh. Now, I know those would be vastly different stations in society, so that would make sense. But I wanted you to explain why the dress was so different for one class of citizen than another.
Well, status was incredibly important in the 16th century. It was very strongly believed that you were put on this earth by God in a particular position in society, and you were breaking God's law to try and move out of that place. So, upward mobility was something that happened, but it wasn't something that was particularly applauded in the 16th century. And one of the big markers of status for a 16th century man or woman is their clothes. And so the styles that the clothes are made in and the materials and the level of decoration all speak volumes to the peer groups that those people were living with. So in terms of the style, it would be very obvious if you were wearing a garment which rendered you unable to do physical work, and that was a good thing in terms of a gentleman wanting to shout out to his contemporaries that he didn't need to do manual labour. He had a bevy of servants around him that could do that stuff for him.
Wow. I don't think I realized how loudly a person's clothes in this time period really spoke about who they were, and just that incredible function that it has there for making these statements about the people wearing them. But I suppose we are moving then with this next question into a particular station of gentlemen in the 16th century or early 17th century. But I wanted to know about accessories. Did men wear accessories like brooches or hats or scarves and other types of just general accessories to their outfits?
Yes, they certainly did. And hats were extremely important. Everybody wore a hat, men and women, actually. And it's one of my bugbears, I have to say, if I'm watching a period drama. One of the things they so often get wrong is that they don't give people hats.
Oh, now I'm going to be watching for that. I won't be able to miss it.
Yeah. They had the whole deference thing that you kind of think of with period dramas of it was polite to remove your hat in certain company, but you always went out with a hat on, and that the style of that hat and the quality of the hat would vary according to your status. Things like brooches and jewellery, the same really. If you could afford some, then you would definitely have some, whether you're a man or a woman. And the late 16th century is a time of incredible exuberance and display for the dress of fashionable men and women. But men certainly were real peacocks. And if you look at any portraits from the time, you can see they're covered in all sorts of bits and pieces.
Well, let's ask about one of the most famous bits and pieces connected to William Shakespeare himself, and that's the famous earring in his left ear. In the Chandos portrait of William Shakespeare, it shows him having this gold earring, and there's massive debate over whether or not Shakespeare would have actually worn an earring. So I want to ask you, as a historical expert in men's fashions from this time period, was it popular for men to wear that kind of earring? Does it make sense that William Shakespeare might have had one?
Yeah, it makes complete sense. It was a fashionable accessory at the time. The simple gold hoop is very much in accordance with his status. I mean, slightly later on, you see portraits of Charles I, for example, with a great big pearl drop earring, and it's nothing like as ostentatious as that, what we see in Shakespeare's ear. It's slightly perplexing that, the other more famous image of him doesn't show it, but then he could as easily not have had it in, or that particular artist chose not to show it. But I don't think there's anything particularly, from my point of view as a costumier, to be read into the fact that he's wearing an earring in that portrait. If it is indeed of him, it's completely of its time.
That's really exciting. Well, what about swords? I noticed in your costumes, some of the men have them, but others don't. Why is that?
Well, swords are worn by gentlemen. It's one of the kind of marks of a gentleman, one of the essential accoutrements, or soldiers. So you don't tend to see your average working guy with a sword, but a gentleman always carries a sword.
What do playwrights carry swords, you think?
I think it's less likely that he did. As I say, it's kind of the sign of a gentleman, really, rather than a middle or merchant class person, unless you're a soldier.
So just above Shakespeare, then, he probably would not have carried a rapier or something like that.
No.
Okay, so everyone who's going to their next costume party as William Shakespeare can take note. No sword. So, well, tell us about the laws concerning clothing in this time period. Are you limited as a costumer in what kinds of cloths or colors you're able to work with? Because you mentioned keeping it historically accurate, and I think there were Elizabethan laws actually concerning which cloth and even which colors your clothes could be when you wore them. Is that correct?
That is correct. We refer to them today as sumptuary laws, and at the time they were called the Acts of Apparel, and they were given out by the reigning monarch at the time, and they had been in England since the 14th century. And what happened, generally speaking, was that as each monarch came along, they kind of added their own favourite restriction that they wanted to the list of things that could and couldn't be worn by different people. And Shakespeare lived in an interesting time, because actually it was when James I of England and VI of Scotland came to the throne that he was the one that said, okay, enough of this, we'll get rid of these acts of apparel.
No more of this. Yeah.
No more of them. But however, I think that I don't expect it made a huge difference to the way that people dressed, because from what we can tell from our research into these acts of apparel is that although there's not much evidence of people being punished or imprisoned or fined for wearing the wrong thing, the evidence that we do have for what people were wearing seems to show that people stuck to the convention of what was expected to be worn by them. And our view is that basically peer pressure was such that it would be an extremely uncomfortable thing to do, to go to church, for example, wearing something that was forbidden by the sumptuary law because it was way above your station. You would be ridiculed and mocked, and people on the whole didn't do it.
It's amazing to me with these kinds of laws that fashion was able to evolve, and, you know, that people changed out things like ruffs, and it would seem like everyone would be on such pens and needles about what to wear and what not to wear that you really wouldn't see a growth. But you can look at the examples you have on your website and see that things like the cape wasn't a big item in the 16th century, but even as early as like 1605, well, now men are wearing a cape. And so how is that happening? How are they having to follow very strict laws and at the same time innovating and being creative with what they're wearing?
Well, yeah, everything does evolve. The thing with capes is capes had been around throughout the whole of the 16th century. You don't see them evidenced quite so much in portraiture, I guess, until the later Elizabethan period, although there are quite a few examples of them earlier on. And the way that the acts of apparel are worded is that it tends to be the main outer garments that they're trying to restrict the use of expensive and especially imported fabric. So one of the driving forces behind the acts of apparel is to try to keep people wearing homegrown and homemade materials to protect the home industries. So they might not specifically mention a cape, they'll say a gown or a doublet or a jerkin because that's what most people are wearing. And there are always ways around it. And that's why the sumptuary laws became more and more complex and longer until the point that James I said, okay, this is ridiculous, and just put a stop to it.
Yeah. So it wasn't so much about controlling what they wore. It was political and economical about, we want you to, you know, push the money of the country, I guess, and the effort towards these certain areas.
Certainly that's the rhetoric that was used, and I think it really was one of the driving forces, but it certainly was also about making sure people kept in their proper place.
What to date has been your favorite costume to produce? Of all these different kinds, which one are you most proud of, or was the most fun to do? That's
a really hard question because, as I said earlier, I think I never do the same thing twice, and everything is such a journey of a discovery and an adventure. It's almost like with every costume I have a favourite stage. I really love researching how a thing is going to be built. I really love the first bit when you cut into the top fabric and you just begin to be able to see how it's going to look. And I love finishing touches like buttonholes and sewing in linings where it all gets neatened up and finished. And then usually by the very end, I'm more than happy to wave goodbye and let it go.
This was work. Moving on.
I've worked on some really extraordinary and gorgeous costumes that have involved teams of embroiderers in India, and lovely silk fabrics, and that is a real joy. But actually, I think where my heart really lies is more with the kind of everyday clothes that are harder to work out how they were made, because we don't have hardly any surviving, and so you've got to look that much harder for the clues. I find that very rewarding.
Well, what happens to the costumes after you make them? Obviously, for a private client, they get to keep it, but the museums and the heritage sites that you've made them for, do they store them? What happens to them?
Well, they always belong to the person that's commissioned them, and then they're nearly always used in some kind of hands-on educational situation. So either the museum staff are wearing the clothes as costumed interpreters, and they're showing people around and giving presentations and talking about the property that they're in. Quite often I make them for children, so visiting school parties come and they have a hands-on session where one of the children will be dressed in the set of clothes and all the other kids get to see the layers going on and talk about it. Or they're simply there for handling, so they'll be in a room where people can actually touch them in a way that you couldn't do with original pieces.
Oh, that's exciting. What a great thing to get to provide for people, to get up close with these historical costumes that are accurate, but you don't have to worry about ruining them.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think it used to be thought that, especially with teaching kids, that it didn't matter too much what the standard of the costume was, that they wouldn't really know the difference. And there's plenty of research now that shows that's just not true. And actually the better standard the reconstruction is, the more useful and educational tool it will be. And as I was saying earlier about my connection with, or feeling that connection with people of the past by making and wearing a set of Tudor clothes, I do feel I can provide that for other people in those environments when they actually get to handle a well-made reconstruction. It is a real connection with people from the past that's very real.
Wow. Well, I have a few questions for you that are not directly related to Shakespeare's costumes or Shakespeare's outfits, I suppose is more appropriate. But do you have anything else before I move to those questions that you would like us to know about historical costuming or Shakespeare's clothes?
I guess it's quite interesting who made the clothes, because that's a common misconception that they were all made by tailors. Even if you were a very poor person, your clothes would be made by a tailor. And of course, all made by hand.
So you didn't have necessarily like a store to go and buy your clothes in. You had to have them all commissioned. You went and said, I would like clothes now, and somebody made them for you?
Yes, that's right. There were tailors. So the word tailor now, I think, conjures up a certain image of quite a smart guy in a suit. And, in the UK, down at Savile Row, where all the posh men's business suits are made. But in the 16th century, tailors came in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and quite a lot of them have more in common really with the kinds of tailors that you'd see working on the streets in India today. They're very efficient, very skilled, very professional, often specialising in one particular kind of garment that they can turn around really quick and very cheaply. But people didn't make their own clothes at home. The exception for this is some linen garments like shirts and smocks, your basic underwear that don't actually involve tailoring. It's more, seamstress work. Those sorts of garments were sometimes made in the home, but everything else was professionally made. I mean, it did mean that people owned far fewer clothes on the whole than we would expect to own today. So you might only have 2 or 3 sets of clothes that were what you would describe as your worst, your middling and your best. which usually equated to your oldest, your not so old, and your newest. But yeah, you couldn't go and buy ready-made clothing in the way that you do today.
How long would it take to put those outfits together? Is it like, how long would they go between having, like, you've got your 3 sets of clothes, you're not so good, you're kind of good, and you're really great. Do they go every so often and have a new set made, or how long does that take to have an outfit produced? And is it the same as how long it takes you to make them now?
Well, how long it takes to make a set of clothes and how often people acquired them are 2 different questions, really. So
yes, I suppose it is. I should have split that up.
No, that's all right. They could be made remarkably quickly. There are quite a lot of accounts of gentlemen, for example, traveling to, really elite gentlemen going, for example, from a court in France to a court in Italy, and deciding along the way that actually, or realizing that the fashion in the court that they're about to go to is quite different from the clothes that they have. And so they decide along the way that they need some more, and they send word ahead to tailors in the next town and say, I'm going to be there in 3 days. I need these 3 new suits. And they get made entirely by hand, and usually by a team of men. So master tailors and their assistants and apprentices, they can make them amazingly quickly. And I think, for me, now having made costumes for 25 years in this way, I may come somewhere close to the speed that they can turn them around, but I doubt I will ever be as quick as they were, because they really were professionals who worked on 1 or 2 types of garments all their lives and became amazingly efficient at doing it.
That's incredibly impressive. I'm to think that they could turn it around that fast, completely from scratch. Now, you said a team of men, though, and so before I move on to my other questions, I have to ask: did women work in as tailors, or was it all men?
It's nearly all men. It's a profession that, like many in the 16th century, are run and regulated by guilds. So you had to be an apprentice for 7 years, and then you had to be what was known as a journeyman. So you had to go out and work under a qualified master tailor for a number of years.
Which is a lot like an internship now, yes?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, I mean, you'd be paid, but it was, not being able to run your own workshop until you had sat an exam to be a master tailor. And then you could set up your own workshop and employ your own apprentices and staff.
Wow.
So there were some women, but they tended to be, sometimes the widows of tailors could apply to the guild to continue their husband's work if that was the only way that they could petition and say, this is the only way we can afford to live. And quite often the guild would look favourably on a woman who had always worked alongside her husband. But officially, tailors were men.
Okay. Well, these last 3 questions are not directly related to your work, but I wanted to ask you to think about books you've read in the last couple of years and tell us about 1 or 2 that immediately come to mind as having had the biggest impact on you or your work.
Well, I think we're quite lucky now in that there's been really quite a lot of books coming out in terms of making reconstructions of period dress that are based on original garments and careful study, careful drawings. There was a lady called Janet Arnold who was very prolific in the 1980s and early 90s, producing books they were called Patterns of Fashion. And she went and looked at original garments in museum collections all over the world, did the most beautiful drawings of them in their existing state, but also in their imagined state, as they would have been before they became very, very worn out and fragile.
Wow.
And she then drew patterns from those garments, which enabled people like me to then reconstruct them. And for years, those were really the only source books that people like me could use. But in the last 10 years, there's been an amazing array of books that have come out, published by the V&A, for example. Susan North is the costume curator at the V&A. She's brought out a couple of books of patterns from the collection at the Victoria and Albert Museum that involve the same kind of drawings and pattern making techniques that Janet Arnold used, but also utilizing X-ray images so you can see the layers inside. And so when we were talking about padding, for example, before, you can see the layers of canvas and bones and things like that are used to construct the garments, and they're pretty amazing.
That's incredible. I'm definitely going to go and find her book. You said it was called Patterns of Fashion?
The Janet Arnold series are called Patterns of Fashion. And the V&A ones are 17th century men's dress and 17th century women's dress. And another great book, actually, especially I think for when you're considering the kind of person that Shakespeare was, is there's a book called Citizen Portrait by Tanya Cooper. And she looks at portraits that were made of middling and merchant class people and discusses why they commissioned the portraits and how they were made and what we can read into them. And that's absolutely fascinating, because we're much more used to seeing portraits of, royalty and the absolute elite. And in fact, there are quite a lot of more provincial middle class people that have been depicted in portraiture that are really, really interesting.
That's excellent. Yeah, that was helpful, because you do usually only see the top shelf. That's a horrible way to put it, but the top section there. So what is your best advice for an aspiring historical costumer? How does someone do their best research into this area of history and start to connect with this kind of industry?
Well, I think if historically accurate reconstructions is what you want to do, then the best thing you can do to start with is just keep your eyes open and just look and look and look at the source material as much as you possibly can. And I know that, especially if you're in the States, that there's less of the original stuff to look at in person. But even looking at portraits and on museum collections online, getting a real feel for the period that you're planning to make reconstructions for, because it's very difficult to get the exact types of materials, trims, fastenings, for example, nowadays, unless you have them specially made. And even if you do have them specially made, you need to know what it is that you're asking to have made. So you need to just get your eye in so that you have a feel for what's right, so that you can create a kind of convincing look. And then in terms of getting into the industry, I'd say, it's experience, really, making stuff, trying it out. And if you can get internships and work placements in the sorts of places you think you'd like to work, if possible, but even in places that you think are not so much for you, I think it's all really helpful to get insights into how other people work and whether that's the sort of thing you want to do.
To sort of try it out. What's next for you? What are you and your team working on now that you're excited about?
Well, myself and my business partner, Jane Malcolm Davis, brought out a book 12 years ago called The Tudor Tailor, Reconstructing 16th Century Dress. And since then, we've brought out a book on Tudor children's clothes and also 2 smaller books on early Tudor clothing. But our current book that we're working on right now has the working title, The Typical Tudor, and it's looking specifically at everyday dress of ordinary people. So since we brought out the Tudor Tailor, we've been researching into the sorts of materials I mentioned before, the wills and the household accounts, the extant archaeological remains that there are, trying to build as full a picture as we can of ordinary people's dress. So I'm about to start making the last garments that we need to be photographed and patterned to include in that book, which we're hoping to publish in the near future.
Oh, very exciting. I know we will anxiously await the publication of that book. Thank you so much for all of your insights and your time today, Ninya. We have loved speaking with you today.
You're very welcome.
To learn more about Ninya, to see her latest book, and find out more about her work in historical Tudor costuming, you can visit the full show notes of today's episode at CassidyCash.com/episode 15. That's CassidyCash.com/EP15.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.